Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the rain and coming out. Deanna informs me that she's been chasing rain, or it's been chasing her now, for her book tour, which started on Tuesday. Congratulations on another publication day.
This is probably my 7th time in Phoenix, and I have literally never seen rain here before. So this is a new experience for me, and I'm finding out it's kind of a new experience for somebody else. But thank you so much for having me back. I love the Poison Pen. It feels like home every time I come here, and you guys are always such a fun crowd to chat with, and it just doesn't feel like work.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Plus, you get to stay at the Hotel Valley Ho, which is, a trip all in and of itself, right?
It is. It's very Rat Pack.
It's actually 1956. They restored it back to them. I think I told you that.
It's got big Dean Martin energy to it.
It
I love
does.
it. It's great fun.
Apparently, it was Scottsdale's original resort, which I think is hilarious. So, and it's a real hotel. I mean, it has elevators compared to other horizontal hotels in Scottsdale. We hosted a mystery conference in 1995, and there were several people who were absolutely outraged. Because they had mobility problems and all, and there was a totally horizontal hotel, so there was just no remedy for it. Which would have been true in the Victorian age, right? Because you don't encounter lots of elevators.
Except elevators were actually invented in the Victorian
They
age,
were.
as were escalators. And escalators were such a novelty and so terrifying that a lot of people got on them and promptly passed out, which is not a good idea when you're on an escalator.
No, it's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
You have to hope for bumpers
they
along
put
the
them,
side.
They put them in department stores towards the end of the 19th century for the first time, and it really freaked people out a lot. But then so did a lot of technology, because the 19th century started with horsepower is how you got around, and candle power is how you illuminated everything. And then by the end of the century, cars had been invented, electricity was being installed, and in the meantime, you navigated the introduction of steam power and gas lighting. So there has probably never been a century with more technological change than the 19th century until you get to ours. And they didn't always navigate it really well. Sometimes they got super freaked out.
I can understand
but I relate.
that.
I get it. I get it.
Me too. If you fly into Dubai and you see the Krups-Tyson machinery, it's just absolutely fabulous. And then my husband and I years ago checked into the Para Palace Hotel in Istanbul, the Agatha Christie Hotel where she wrote, and they have a little steam-powered elevator. And a captain with the gold braid and whatever it is, turned around because they weren't going to let you get in and run their steam-powered elevator to go up 2 floors. Right. So they've kept it on, which I think is fabulous, isn't it?
That's charming.
It is charming. Right, so tell me about Jack the Ripper. What is the magnetism of Jack the Ripper?
Okay, so first of all, a caveat. This is not a Jack the Ripper book.
No.
This is Jack the Ripper adjacent. Because the problem is when you write a Victorian series and you're writing and you get to the autumn of 1888, you cannot write that book without discussing Jack the Ripper, because of the fact that it was the biggest story anywhere in the UK, anywhere in Europe for that matter. It was the story. It was a huge story in America. And as soon as the crimes started, everybody started turning on each other. There was factionalism. People started blaming the rich, people started blaming the poor, people started blaming Catholics, people started blaming Jews, they blamed the immigrants. Everybody turned on everybody. Gee, what's that like?
It's a very modern ring to the whole thing.
Very modern ring to the whole thing. And so people, it just was the story that overshadowed everything that went on at the time. So I knew I had to deal with it on some level, but I really didn't want my sleuths to be figuring out who Jack the Ripper is, because honestly, I don't care who Jack the Ripper was. I am far more interested in the 5 women who are the canonical victims of his crimes, because they deserve to be remembered. There is a lot to their story that we get wrong, because it's what we've been told, and it's a very encapsulated version. A lot of times we don't even discuss their names. We're told that they're prostitutes, and the truth is a lot more nuanced than that. They weren't prostitutes in the way that we think of prostitutes, people who engaged in sex work as a primary means of income. These were women who were at the bottom tier of society, and they cobbled together their income from a number of different sources. They would go to Kent and they would when beer making. They would go and pick the hops when the hops were ripe. They would go and they would make flowers, little piecework. They would make silk flowers for milliners to sell. And when they couldn't put 2 pennies together to hire a bed for the night, that's when they would go and turn tricks. That's when they would turn to sex work. So it was not something they did 24/7, but we don't know the nuances of their lives. We don't know all the intricacies of where they came from, who they were. And then last year, a writer by the name of Hallie Rubenhold wrote a fantastic book called The Five. It is highly, highly recommended. It is about the 5 canonical victims, and she really did so much of the detail to their lives I didn't know was actually out there, very easy to find. It's just nobody had ever written about it before, and she wrote about it, and it's a fantastic book. So in A Murderous Relation, I tried really, really hard to stay away from who's Jack, and go with this is the reality of what was going on in London at the time. This is the kind of impact it had on people's lives. We don't tend to think of London as being a place where you would have tent cities for the homeless, and yet in 1888 there was one in Trafalgar Square, right under Lord Nelson's statue, and it was a time where there was a whole lot of anxiety. The technology that I talked about a few minutes ago was making people really tense. The influx of immigrants, the changes to the laws, because this was a decade where suddenly women could own property. They had never been allowed to own property before. And it became a big deal, because when you got married, your property that had belonged to your father and that was given to you, put in your name, passed to your husband, and he had complete control over it. He had complete control over the children. You had nothing that you could call your own until the Married Women's Property Act started being passed. And so suddenly changes are coming about, incremental changes, and a lot of people were very, very nervous about that. And so this was a time where there was just tremendous upheaval, and so everything was changing. And I think that's one of those things that we can really relate to and say, yeah, I get it. I understand where all the anxiety was coming from.
It's also a useful thing to point out that women, a reasonable choice was to be a spinster, because then you could own your own property and so forth. If you had children, they were yours, unless the father somehow made a claim. Or to be a widow, which was the best of all worlds, because that actually really was.
Widowhood was where it was at.
Yeah,
like,
totally.
And
because there was often a very large age gap, between the men and younger brides and so forth, there were a lot of widows and young widows, many of whom chose not to remarry because they finally achieved some degree of independence.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you were widowed, you usually got what was called your jointure, which was a settlement that your husband or his family would have made upon you. It was generally decided on in the terms of the wedding contracts. So everybody thinks prenups are something that just got invented in the last 40 years. No, prenups existed for centuries. They just didn't call them that. And so one of the things that would be decided in this prenuptial agreement is, what does she get when you die? Because it's your obligation as her husband to provide for her to the end of her life. So you give her property, you give her money, and that way she can continue to live in the manner in which she has become accustomed. Because the idea was that you were supposed to support her at the same level as when she had been a wife. And so a lot of women really did not like the idea of getting remarried after that, because suddenly I've got money, I can travel, nobody cares if I take a lover. This is awesome.
You didn't have to be chaperoned as a widow.
No, and you could be an 18-year-old widow and suddenly you don't have to be chaperoned. Whereas if you're a 25-year-old unmarried woman, you still have to be chaperoned. Your younger sister could theoretically act as your chaperone because of the fact that marriage conferred a certain degree of authority and respectability to you that a spinster wouldn't necessarily have, until she gets so old that she's on the shelf and couldn't possibly be having sexy thoughts.
29, you were just, that was it, dead in the water. I remember I'm trying to remember which actor, it was Sarah Bernhardt, I think it was, wowed everybody when she said she took her last lover at age 67. I'm going, okay. I mean, it was really a big deal. I know. How many of you watched Sanderson? Did some of you watch it? No, okay. Because they actually forgot about the basic rules, and they let this young woman wander around unchaperoned and other things, which would, believe me, never have happened. For dramatic purposes, yes, but it was just really improbable.
Yeah, because that's one of those things that people would have talked about. And the single worst thing that can happen for you if you are a young woman looking to get married is to be talked about, because your reputation is everything. Your hymen is gold. So you absolutely have to. That went out on the internet right now. My mother is going to hear this.
That's going to go on the cover of her Bookstore. I love it. You know what? We had the cutest guy who was here. He's taken over the Robert Ludlum franchise. Yeah, we were talking about the amazing fight scenes in pace of his book, and I complimented him on the fact that it just moved right along. And he said that his tagline was, "All killer, no filler." I told him it's about every book from now on. But now we have yours. I love it. Well, I was sort of leading up to Veronica. The choices that she makes and the life that she leads really, in part, is a function of all this that we are talking about. She likes being independent. She likes to command her own. But she also is faced with how to earn some sort of a living because she does not have that jointure or,
No, she doesn't.
father settlement.
Veronica grows up believing that she is an orphan and has no family, and so she has to, even though she has been fairly gently bred, she has to earn a living. And that's the marker in Victorian times between a lady and someone who's not a lady, or a gentleman and someone who's not a gentleman, is, do you earn a living? Because what you were supposed to do, ideally, is have passive income from agriculture. That's what made you a gentleman. There were a handful of gentlemanly occupations where you could work, you could earn a salary, and you could still be a gentleman, a vicar.
You could be in the clergy or the military and maybe a lawyer. You certainly couldn't be a doctor or a surgeon.
You could be a doctor but not a surgeon.
Right.
A doctor's wife could be presented at court. A surgeon's wife could not. A doctor was referred to as doctor. A surgeon in England was referred to as Mr. And the reason for the distinction, surgeons were very much lower on the social scale than doctors. Exactly the opposite of what we have. And the reason for that is because a surgeon works with his hands. A surgeon actually cuts into you, whereas a physician will sit there and say, "Tell me about your symptoms." And you can tell him about your symptoms, and he doesn't necessarily have to get all icky and touch you. And so that was the distinction that they made between surgeons and doctors. For women, really the only thing that existed that was ladylike is governessing. That was kind of that gray area.
Or being a companion. You could actually be a companion, like to a widow or something.
Being a companion, yeah, absolutely. But that was that gray area where you could, if you were invited, eat with the family, but most of the time you'd have a sad little tray in your room all by yourself. And the other thing that really became a big deal during the end of the Victorian age was natural history, and everybody started collecting. And a lot of people, the rise of the middle class people were always trying to seem better than they were, and so they would adopt the customs and the interests and the enthusiasms of the upper classes. And one of the things that the upper classes had been doing for 400 years was collecting natural history specimens. And you could go out and collect butterflies, which is what my character Veronica does, and you could sell them for a really good amount of money. She could sell one particularly good specimen for maybe 3 guineas, which, to put it in perspective for you, a lady's maid would earn 90 guineas a year. So in a very short period of time, Veronica could earn a living wage, and it was considered to be a fairly genteel occupation, because you run through a meadow with a net, you drop your butterfly in a killing jar, you're not getting your hands too terribly dirty. In my case, I based Veronica, or she was inspired, I should say, by a Victorian female explorer by the name of Margaret Fountain. Margaret was a lepidopterist, which is just the fancy word for butterfly hunter. And she hunted butterflies. She was one of those women who was kind of forced into earning a little bit of money for herself, and she needed to do it in a genteel way. And so Margaret hopped off and went hunting butterflies, and she was very, very good at it. She would hunt to order. If somebody wanted specific specimens, she would kind of go to the part of the world where those butterflies were, collect enough for them, collect enough for a lot of other people and other institutions, because museums were collecting, places like that. So she would go collect these things, sell them off, and then finance her next trip. Well, Margaret amassed her own collection of butterflies, which was really, really extensive and lovely. And Margaret kept journals everywhere she went. And so when she died, and she was such a badass, she was butterflying well into her 70s and dropped dead with her butterfly net in her hand on the island of Santo Domingo. They've got a nice little rock next to where she fell to mark the spot. She left her butterfly collection and her journals to a university in England and said, don't open my journals for 70 years, which is a really common thing when you will your papers, because you don't want everybody reading everything that you have to, that you went through, or, if you decided to name names with some scandals, hopefully everyone's dead by that point. So they saved her journals for 70 years, and then when they opened them, they found out that the whole time Margaret had been traveling the world, she was collecting butterflies and she was collecting lovers the entire time. Margaret was getting some everywhere she went. Margaret had interracial relationships. Margaret had extramarital relationships. Margaret had relationships wherever Margaret wanted.
She must have had fabulous birth control at a time when it was pretty chancy.
Margaret was a natural historian and understood how biology worked.
And was probably lucky on top of
Yeah,
it. But
exactly.
The thing is that you could do all that unless you got pregnant, and then you really did have an enormous problem. Hi, sorry, I don't sort of have my back to you over here. Right, so, it's true that some people were, just sterile. I remember asking Elizabeth Peters, who based in the Peabody, which if you haven't read it are truly fabulous, on a real Victorian woman whose name has gone out of my head. But anyway, how did they cope as a married couple, often? And the answer was abstinence, because there really was no other, completely safe.
No, I mean,
Way
there were
to do
things
it.
that you could do, but nothing was fail-safe. For
Except
sure.
abstinence,
And then,
right.
exactly. And another thing that's really been surprising to me is the more I read of journals and memoirs and things like that of Victorian wives, is how often they set the parameters for the intimate relationships with their husbands when they would say, yeah, I'm really done with all of this. And the husbands were just expected to accept that. Certain husbands would push past that and not take no for an answer, but the vast majority of them said, okay, and just went off and did their own thing. And so the wives, instituted the custom of the separate bedroom and just said, no, I'm not having any part of that. Keep that to yourself. And especially if they had already produced the heir, then that was well and good. And some of them didn't even wait that long before they said, no, I'm not having anything to do with that. And it's astonishing to see how many of the husbands just rolled over and said, fine, and proceeded to take care of matters elsewhere.
Okay, well, but that's not going on with Veronica and Revelstoke, or, they need to get started before they can stop. So,
Yes, but Veronica has a keen appreciation for the health-giving benefits of intimacy.
regular sex.
Yes,
Right.
she as a natural historian feels that regular Congress is a healthful thing, and that you should engage in it. I think in one book she even makes a remark that you can get congested if you don't, and so that's why it's
An interesting medical theory.
reproductively congested if you don't indulge, and so.
She's the product, though, of a liaison herself. I wonder if
She
that
is.
has not affected, her perspective.
Well, but Veronica had already set up her parameters for how she was going to behave well before she discovered the truth of who she was. Because Veronica, the first book is when Veronica turns 25. That's A Curious Beginning. And she turns 25, and in the course of that book, figures out her true parentage. And she already has a good 7 years under her belt of traveling at that point and, making acquaintances around the world. So
You've had a lot of fun with this, haven't you?
I have the best time with these books. They're so much fun to write.
Right. So they're back from, how many of you read the last book where they were off on the island, which I thought was wonderful. It was a real Agatha Christie scenario, right? It was just terrific. There they were. And now you've brought them back to London. And how have they changed as a consequence of that experience in Cornwall?
A Murderous Relation, which is book 5, literally opens the day after book 4 ends. So there's not really a whole lot of time for reflection. One of them has been lightly stabbed, and is still, kind of thinking about that. So they haven't had a whole lot of time to deal with the consequences yet.
But they're summoned dramatically back to London,
summoned
right?
dramatically back to London. Yes, there is Lady Wellingtonia Beauclerc, who is I have a fondness for older women who take no prisoners, and they kind of find their way into all of my books. I end up writing one character for every book, and with this series, it's Lady Welly. And she is an éminence grise. She's the power behind the throne. She does a lot of the dirty work, protecting the royals from themselves, and kind of cleaning up their messes, and sometimes taking care of them when they don't even know she's taking care of them. But this time, one of them has actually come to her for help, and so she, telegraphs Stoker and Veronica and says, "Oh, you have to come now," and they do, because they're nice people.
Unfortunately, there's train travel, so it's not,
Yes.
stays in a coach
Exactly.
bucketing along from Cornwall back to London.
Exactly.
So the person who, Lady Wellington, how much of this do we want to say? But you could at
Well,
least
I mean,
do
it
that.
all basically happens in the first chapter, so
Right.
it's not too spoilery to say that
Okay.
it's that the royal who has come to her for help is Princess Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, who ended up becoming Queen Alexandra when Victoria died and her oldest son became Edward VII, because this was his wife. She was formerly Alexandra of Denmark. I saw a couple of her gowns at the Met. Did you see them?
Yeah.
Her waist was about
But that required corsetry.
heavy corsetry, but still, she was very, very slender through the whole of her life. Incredibly elegant gowns, gorgeous purple sequins, which you would not think, but they were styling. Anyway, so Princess Alexandra has asked for help on behalf of her son, Prince Eddie. If you know anything about the Ripper murders, then you know that there was a theory at one point that a member of the royal family might have been Jack the Ripper. It's complete codswallop. He absolutely was not. That's a theory that was devised in the 1970s, and it's been debunked so many times.
Part of it was because it was so secretive, and Scotland Yard sealed up its files and all, and so one explanation might have been that it was, the royal family that would be damaging and so forth. But Eddie was not all, I don't want to say he wasn't all there, but he was not
Bless his heart.
sparkling.
And I'm Southern, so when I say bless his heart.
Right, yeah, bless his little heart, right.
Yeah.
He was not an entirely altogether great specimen, and
No,
he
he
died.
was not.
And his younger brother, George, who Eddie was engaged to marry the woman who became Queen Mary of Teck. When he died, Mary was passed on to George in the same way that when Arthur died, Catherine of Aragon was passed on to Henry VIII. It was never, they've already got a contract with the princess.
Exactly.
It's like, who's going to fill it,
Exactly. And when Queen Victoria was doing the vetting of, all her grandchildren's spouses, it just seemed the easiest thing to do. Eddie was kind of a trip, God love him. He was Alexandra and Bertie's oldest son. He would have been King of England if he had survived, but as Barbara said, he died a few years after the action in A Murderous Relation takes place. He was known as Collars and Cuffs by his father, who didn't like him very much, because of the fact that he had an almost unnaturally long neck, very, very long arms, and so his tailor had to specially make his collars and his cuffs. And his father was one for nicknames and poking fun at people, and so he called him Collars and Cuffs. Eddie was kind of sweetly a mama's boy. He was terrified of his father. Most of Bertie's children were terrified of them, or terrified of him, because he was terrified of his mother. Queen Victoria scared them all. And so it just became a family tradition that you wanted your children frightened of you. And Eddie certainly was very scared, but he was never scared of Alexandra. She was gentle. She was deaf for most of her life, and she was a very indulgent mother. The deafness caused her to perhaps not be quite as socially active as she would have been otherwise. She was much more of a homebody. Bertie was off with his mistresses all the time, and Alexandra loved her children, and she indulged Eddie. Eddie was not always in the most robust health, and so she had a very, very soft spot in her heart for him, and mourned him tremendously when he died, which is more than most people did, because there was one newspaper editorial after he died that essentially, reading between the lines, was, oh, thank God he's not going to be king. Because he probably would have
There's
been
kind of a familiar feeling at the moment too, right?
he would have been fairly disastrous at it.
I don't mean
And
the British royals, sorry.
he would have ended up being king during World War I, and he would have been catastrophic at it. Whereas his younger brother George was King George V, and was a very firm hand on the tiller during World War I, and did a remarkable job of reinventing and rebranding the British royal family. When all of his relatives were losing their thrones, the Brits kept theirs because George knew what he was doing and managed to hang on and kind of steer England through that. And Eddie
rebranded the family from German names to English names too. That's when they became Windsor.
He did. One of his courtiers came up with the idea of changing the surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, because that evoked this image of Windsor Castle, which was a very, kind of proud British thing for the people. And of his own volition, George greatly streamlined the British royal family and took HRHs away from a lot of people and told them, no, we're going to be a lot narrower. We don't need everybody dragging off the public coffers and taking money. We need to streamline. We need to be British. And so the members of the family who spoke German were encouraged to speak better English than they had in the past. And he did a very good job. And that would have been far beyond Eddie's talents. Love him.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, do you think he was a bit of a birth accident or what? I mean, he really was. No, I'm serious.
In what sense of the word, Barbara?
Sometimes people just don't have great genes. I bet.
Well, the funny thing is,
I didn't mean that, nastily. I just meant that he was not ever, it seemed quite
no, he
quite
wasn't.
normal.
But the funny thing is, if you look at his father, if you look at Bertie never measured up to his older sister, Victoria, who became Empress Frederick of Germany. Bertie was always lagging behind her in the schoolroom. She was Victoria and Albert's first child. She was Albert's favorite child. She was brilliant. She would have made a wonderful queen. And then here comes Bertie, and he just can't hold a candle to her. She was clever. She was sharp. She was devoted to Prince Albert, absorbed a lot of his liberal politics, and really tried very, very hard to kind of change the course of Germany, and failed abysmally. Due to no fault of her own, but Bertie never measured up, and that was one of those things that you see over and over again in the British royal family. And it's fascinating when you look at it that within a generation you will have such a wide variation of natural ability, as well as how they're schooled, how they're taken care of, how they're nurtured. Because a lot of times a completely different type of attention is paid to the child everyone expects to inherit the throne. And then when that child dies and someone else has to step in, suddenly you realize, oh, we probably shouldn't have neglected that child's education so much, because now they have to rule. This is why, if you've ever seen the King's Speech, and George VI, who's the present Queen's father, kind of breaks down in tears when he realizes his brother's abdicating, he's going to have to become king, and he says, I don't know how to read state papers, I'm just a naval officer. That happened over and over and over again in the British royal family, where you would have a younger child, did not have the proper education or training, and kind of did not know what to do when they ended up ascending the throne and were out of their depth. But the danger is, you don't want to over-educate a younger child, because then you give them ideas. You make them ambitious, and then you end up with Richard III. Doing all sorts of nasty things to his nephews.
Then you end up with a Lion in Winter.
Yeah.
If any of you remember seeing that, when you have rival claimants in the children. I know, it's a wonderful movie. I've always thought Peter O'Toole just really nailed it.
Oh, Peter O'Toole is like my Patronus. I love that. I love that man. Yeah.
That's great.
Yes, I had my very first book tour when I was in Seattle. I had a media escort who had escorted him, and I said, "Tell me everything." And she said, "Okay, I know you're probably thinking that he was really charming, and he was really sexy, and he was really, really debonair, and I don't want to disappoint you, but he was 100 times more of those things." I was like, "Oh, thank God." She said he was so much more Peter O'Toole than you even expected him to be. She said it was the greatest escort. Well, she didn't escort him in that way, but she said it was the greatest media escort experience she ever had.
Probably regretted it that she
Probably
was
so.
right. Full service
I think if he
escort.
had asked.
You know, I always think, how many of you saw The Lion in Winter? Do you remember that glorious moment when the king strides up to the front of the stage? His children are trying to plot to kill him and take the throne, and his wife is over here doing this and that. It's just a disaster. And he looks down at the audience and he says, "I don't know what people are going to write about my life, but I will say it's going to read a lot better than it's lived." Which I thought was just a wonderful comment. You know.
It's full of great lines. It really is.
I almost wish that he actually said it. You know, we don't
William
really.
Goldman put a lot of good
Yes,
dialogue
we don't
into that.
really know that.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to your book. So
Sure.
so Alexandra comes to Lady Welly.
Lady Welly is the fixer. She's the
She's
closer
the fixer,
for them. So
and-
she, Alexandra turns to her and says, "Eddie's gotten himself into a scrape. I need some help." And so Welly's idea is, "All right, I'll haul in Stoker and Veronica. They're the ones who can get this done."
So she's the fixer, but they're the agents of the fixer, right?
Exactly. Well, Wellingtonia is in her 80s at this point because she was born in 1816. She was named. Her father was an aide de camp to Wellington, and so she was named Wellingtonia in his honor, in the same way that a lot of people were named Horatia after Lord Nelson. And so she's been around for a little while, and so she's not quite as agile as she used to be. She's taking it a little bit easier, so she needs a fresh pair of legs to go out and do a lot of the grunt work for her.
Right.
So.
So a really nice thing about this book is that you get to spend time with Prince Eddie, and I can't actually think of another book where you got to spend quality time with Prince Eddie, and he wasn't, being berated as not up to the royal standard. So that was very nice.
It was a lot of fun to write him. It really was, because the biographies just disagree so vehemently about what kind of person he was that it kind of gave me license to do whatever I wanted. And I wrote him as being a sort of sweetly clueless, entitled guy, because that's the one thing that seemed to fit every image of him and every set of circumstances. Is he's a person who's been born to extreme privilege, extraordinary privilege, to the point where he almost doesn't even quite know how privileged he is. And at the same time, he's not a bad person. He's not a particularly gifted person. The gift was the accident of birth. It was not in any resources within himself. He's not particularly clever, but he's sweet. He's sweet.
There he is, right?
And that's what his mother
He's
saw in him.
sweet
That's what
in a scrape, and so here we go.
He's sweet.
And
And,
I know-
and a little dim.
Right. So Veronica and Stoker kind of came to a sort of a point at the end of book 4. Are you postponing that?
I say nothing. I say no.
You have to read the
spoilers
book
for
to
you.
find out,
Read the
right?
book.
Read the book to find out.
It's we've been doling out their relationship in little bits and pieces as we
Okay.
go along. So there's a little push me pull you kind of thing going on there. So as far as specifics of what happens or doesn't happen in this book, I'm
You don't need to tell
I'm
us. I'm
forbidden.
just pointing it
I'm
out.
forbidden
Right.
from speaking of it.
You are. So one hopes that you're hard at work on the next one.
Yes, Veronica 6 is written.
Oh, even
And
better.
I have to go home and revise it, but I just got an email from my editor saying, yeah, there's not much to revise, you're good. So, so that's good to know. So that one will be out next year. And last week, I signed a contract for a contemporary, my first contemporary.
Wow.
And it is about 4 female assassins who are 60 and who band together.
Yes.
Who band together to take out the head of a government agency who has targeted them.
So we go up higher. Could you take out somebody higher?
Maybe they'll go off piste and kind of do a little freelancing.
Right.
Yeah, so I am super excited about that. And then there's another Veronica to come that I'm under contract for, number 7. I actually have to write the proposal for that one in
Nice.
May. Yeah.
What's
So-
going on with your earlier books in terms of film rights and so forth? Because there's been a discussion about that in the past.
Yes, they were. The Julia Gray series was in development for a TV series, and the option was renewed, and then it lapsed. So, if any of you are producers, the rights are once more available.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I love
It
Lady
happens,
Julia.
you know. Just going from, it's like selling the option. A lot of people get super excited when they sell the rights because they think, oh, this definitely, no, that means you're one tiny step closer to having it happen. The odds against having something made are just astronomical. So yeah.
Yes,
I mean,
but my motive is pure because what I want is another Lady Julia or two. And so my thought was that it would be far more likely to happen if there were a TV series.
that
so.
is absolutely true.
Yep,
Yes,
so
it's far
that's my
likelier
hope.
for another Julia book or two if we get a TV
I
series.
really love Lady Julia. I miss her, you know? I mean,
Thank you.
you all miss Lady Julia too? Right. Man, I like Veronica a lot, but it's different.
It is. They're very different women. Veronica is a little more in your face. She's younger. She's a little more brash. Julia has 5 years and a completely different life experience. So Julia has a different perspective than Veronica. But I'm having a lot of fun writing Veronica right now. So
I can see that. So maybe we should take questions from the audience.
I love questions from the
And
audience.
we will do that. Renee, do you know how to turn off the phone? You can find out. Right. Oh, never mind. There's Patrick popping out from his office. Right. I'd like to thank our TV audience for watching us tonight. And wishing you a very pleasant good evening.